Megan stood by the window, her fingers tracing the edge of her phone as she glanced at the time once more. Her heart raced in anticipation. It had been 2 long years since she and Nolan last stood face to face, and today, that would finally change. She opened her phone and scrolled through their old text messages, the playful banter, the promises of a future together. It felt surreal that they had made it through the distance, the video calls, and the late-night messages. And now, they had their chance to start fresh, together. A soft sigh escaped her as she ran her hand through her hair, eyes drifting to the framed photo of them on her desk. Nolan's arm was wrapped around her, his smile wide and carefree. That was how she wanted to remember him. That's how he'd always been, confident, assured, the steady anchor in her life. She couldn't help but imagine their life from now on. No more lonely nights, no more calls from across oceans, just the two of them, together in the same city. The airport was buzzing with travelers, but all Megan could think about was Nolan. She scanned the arrivals gate anxiously, searching for his familiar face. Then, as if the world paused for just a moment, she saw him. Nolan stood there, his tall frame slightly hunched under the weight of his travel bag, his eyes searching the crowd. The moment their eyes met, everything else disappeared. Megan felt her breath catch, her feet carrying her swiftly toward him. "Nolan," she called out, her voice thick with emotion. He turned, breaking into a warm, if slightly weary, smile. They embraced tightly, the world around them fading into a blur of distant voices and footsteps. Megan inhaled the familiar scent of his cologne, grounding herself in his presence. "I missed you so much," she whispered, her cheek pressed against his chest. "Missed you too," Nolan replied, but there was a slight hesitation in his tone that she couldn't place. As they pulled away, Nolan brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, his eyes searching hers. "You look great, Meg," he said, though his voice lacked the same enthusiasm she remembered. She pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to his long flight. The drive home was filled with conversation about mundane things. His journey, her work, plans for the week. Yet something felt different. It wasn't anything overt. Nolan was kind and attentive, just as he always was. But there were small things, like how he asked about her new apartment as if they hadn't talked about it before, or how he hesitated when recalling their plans for that weekend. Megan glanced at him as he stared out the window, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. She wanted to believe it was just nerves or jet lag, but a seed of doubt began to take root. Maybe she was being paranoid, maybe it was all in her head. After all, it had been years since they were last together, and adjusting wasn't supposed to be easy. As they arrived at her apartment, Megan felt a wave of relief. "Home sweet home," she said, trying to keep her voice light. Nolan gave a soft smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. That night, as they lay in bed together, Nolan's arm draped over her waist, Megan stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She told herself it was just the exhaustion of the reunion, that things would settle once they had time. But still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that Nolan was holding something back. In the darkness, she made a promise to herself, tomorrow would be better. They had waited this long to be together, and now it was time to finally start their future. As the days passed, Megan tried to settle into the new rhythm of having Nolan by her side. It felt surreal at first, having him here in her apartment, in the city she had always wished they could share. But soon, the initial excitement began to fade, replaced by a quiet, nagging unease. They spent their days together, exploring the city, revisiting old haunts, and trying to recreate the magic of their long-distance relationship. But the more they tried to reconnect, the more Megan noticed the small things Nolan had forgotten. It started subtly. He asked if her favorite cafe had always been on the corner of 6th Street, even though they'd spent hours there during his last visit. She brushed it off, chalking it up to the fact that it had been a long time. But the forgetfulness didn't stop there. One afternoon, as they strolled through the park, Megan mentioned the picnic Nolan had surprised her with on his last trip. He smiled, but there was an awkward pause, the kind that told her he was searching for a memory he couldn't quite reach. Of course. That was a good day, he said, but his hesitation was palpable. Megan's heart sank. It had been one of her favorite moments together, but now it felt as if it had slipped through his fingers, lost to time. She tried not to overthink it. Nolan had been under stress lately, adjusting to a new city, a new life. Everyone forgets little things sometimes, she told herself. But the tension continued to build. Megan found herself watching him more closely, looking for signs, small, fleeting moments where he seemed disconnected from their shared past. That evening, they cooked dinner together, laughter filling the kitchen as they navigated the cramped space. For a brief moment, it felt like old times, like the Nolan she knew was fully present. But when she asked him to grab the salt from the usual cabinet, he stood still, looking lost. "It's in the left cabinet, like always," she said, her voice light, trying to mask her growing concern. Nolan blinked, then opened the wrong cabinet, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Right, sorry. I guess I'm still adjusting." Megan laughed it off, but the knot in her stomach tightened. This was more than just adjusting. This was something deeper. The realization gnawed at her, making the room feel smaller and the distance between them larger than ever before. That night, as they lay in bed, Megan stared at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Nolan's arm was draped over her, his breathing steady beside her, but she felt a million miles away. She wanted to say something, to ask him if he was okay, but the fear of what he might say stopped her. What if this wasn't just stress? What if something was really wrong? In the darkness, her mind raced through possibilities. Maybe he was exhausted from the move. Maybe it was just the stress of being together again after so much time apart. But then again, maybe it wasn't. Megan knew she couldn't ignore it much longer. The man lying next to her was still Nolan, the man she loved. But piece by piece, it felt like she was losing him, and that terrified her. As sleep eluded her, Megan promised herself she would ask him tomorrow. No more second-guessing, no more pretending everything was fine. She needed to know what was happening. And deep down, she feared the answer might change everything. The next day, Megan couldn't keep quiet any longer. The tension had grown unbearable, gnawing at her every thought. She watched Nolan as he stood by the window, gazing out at the city below. He seemed distracted, lost in his own world, and it only made the knot in her chest tighten. "Nolan," she began, her voice careful but firm. "We need to talk." He turned to face her, and she saw it, just a flicker in his eyes, something between fear and resignation. He knew this conversation had been coming. "Meg, I know what you're going to say," he replied, his voice heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. "But before you do, there's something I need to tell you." Megan's heart pounded. She had braced herself for this, but hearing the edge of desperation in his voice unnerved her. "I've been hiding something," Nolan continued, his hands trembling slightly. "I didn't want to scare you or make you worry while we were apart. I thought I could handle it. But things are getting worse." "What do you mean worse?" Megan asked, her breath catching. Nolan's gaze dropped, unable to meet her eyes. "I've been diagnosed with a condition. It affects my memory. Progressive memory loss. It's been getting worse over the last year." Megan felt the air leave her lungs. She stared at him, uncomprehending, as his words began to sink in. "You've been losing your memory? Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to burden you," Nolan said, his voice cracking. "I thought if I could just keep things normal for a little longer, we could have more time. I didn't want this to be our life. I didn't want you to have to live with it." Megan's mind raced, her thoughts a jumble of confusion and hurt. "So, you've been forgetting things? Like the cafe, the picnic, all those little moments?" Nolan nodded, his eyes full of guilt. "Yeah. It started small, just little things. But lately, it's been getting harder to remember us." The weight of his words hit Megan like a punch to the gut. He had been losing pieces of their life together, and she hadn't even noticed. Every forgotten detail, every lost moment, was more than just forgetfulness. It was Nolan slipping away from her, one memory at a time. "I didn't want you to know, Meg. I didn't want to lose you before I had to." Tears welled in her eyes. "And now what? What happens to us?" Nolan shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know. I don't have the answers. All I know is, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." I'm sorry I kept this from you. Megan felt her heart breaking. She had imagined so many futures with Nolan, but this was never one of them. She wanted to be angry, to yell at him for hiding something so important, but all she could feel was sadness. Sadness for what they were losing, for the man she loved, who was slowly being taken away from her. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the silence thick with unspoken emotions. Megan didn't know what to say, how to process this. All she knew was that their lives would never be the same. The days following Nolan's confession were a blur. Megan tried to absorb the gravity of his condition, but every conversation felt like walking on eggshells, as if acknowledging the truth too openly might break them both. She watched him more closely now, noticing each little falter, each time he hesitated when recalling a memory they shared. It was devastating, knowing he was slipping away from her with every passing day. But something still didn't sit right. Despite Nolan's confession, Megan couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding something back. The way he avoided certain questions, the distant look in his eyes, it felt like there was more he wasn't telling her. She tried to ignore the nagging feeling, but it grew stronger each day. One afternoon, while Nolan was out, Megan decided to clean up his travel bag, hoping to distract herself. As she sifted through his belongings, her hand brushed against a thick envelope tucked deep into the corner. Curious, she pulled it out, her heart quickening as she recognized the official-looking documents inside. Medical papers. Megan hesitated. She shouldn't invade his privacy like this, but something urged her to open it. Slowly, she unfolded the papers, scanning the dates and the unfamiliar medical terminology. And then she saw it. The diagnosis had been made 3 years ago. 3 years. Not one. Her breath caught in her throat as the truth hit her. Nolan had known about this for far longer than he had let on. He hadn't just been hiding it for a year, he had been keeping this secret for the majority of their relationship. Megan's hands trembled as she reread the words. How could he have hidden something so monumental from her for so long? How much of their life together had been a lie? All those moments, those memories she had thought were precious to both of them, had they even meant anything to him? The sound of the door opening jolted her back to reality. Nolan was home. She quickly shoved the papers back into his bag, her mind racing. Her heart pounded in her chest as she heard his footsteps approaching. She had to confront him, but the words felt stuck in her throat, choking her. "Hey," Nolan's voice called from the hallway. "I grabbed some coffee on the way back." Megan swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her ears. She couldn't pretend anymore. Not after what she had just seen. "Nolan," she said, her voice tight, "we need to talk." He stepped into the room, his face instantly tense at the tone of her voice. "What is it?" Megan held up the medical papers. "I found these." The color drained from Nolan's face as his eyes fell on the envelope. His entire body stiffened, and for a long moment he said nothing. "You told me it had been a year," Megan continued, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and betrayal. "But these papers, these say 3 years. You've known about this for 3 years, Nolan." Nolan's face crumpled with guilt, his shoulders sagging. "Megan, why didn't you tell me?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Why did you keep this from me for so long?" Nolan sank into a chair, his hands covering his face. "Because I didn't want you to leave," he said, his voice muffled. "I didn't want you to see me like this. I thought I could still be the man you fell in love with. I didn't want you to look at me differently." Megan's heart ached. She had known Nolan was hiding something, but this was so much worse than she had imagined. "You've been lying to me, Nolan. You've been pretending to remember things you don't even remember anymore. I've been living in a fantasy, and I didn't even know it." Nolan looked up at her, his eyes filled with pain. "I didn't want to hurt you." "Well, you did," Megan said, tears stinging her eyes. "And now, I don't know what to do." The silence between them was thick, filled with the weight of everything unsaid. Megan had no idea how to move forward from this. She loved Nolan, but how could she trust him again after all this? Megan had always imagined the tough decisions in life would come with clear answers. But now, standing in the kitchen, staring at the man she loved, she felt utterly lost. Nolan sat across from her, looking more fragile than ever before. His confession hung in the air between them, an unspoken admission of the future they would never have. After what felt like an eternity, Megan broke the silence. "I need some air." Nolan nodded silently, his eyes heavy with the guilt and pain of everything he had kept from her. Megan grabbed her coat and stepped outside, the cool evening air hitting her skin like a wake-up call. She walked to the park without thinking, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. The truth was out, and yet nothing felt resolved. Nolan had been hiding this illness for years, pretending to be someone he no longer was. The betrayal stung, but deeper than that, Megan felt an overwhelming sadness for the man she loved, the man who was slowly losing himself. She found a bench and sat down, staring at the trees swaying in the wind. Was there still a future for them? Could she love a man who wouldn't remember her? A man who had already forgotten so many pieces of their life together? The logical part of her mind told her to walk away, to protect herself from the inevitable heartbreak that would come as Nolan's condition worsened. But love wasn't logical, and no matter how much she tried to convince herself otherwise, Megan knew she couldn't just leave him. She loved Nolan. That hadn't changed, even if everything else had. Megan sat there for what felt like hours, replaying their relationship in her mind, trying to hold onto the memories they had made together. Even if Nolan couldn't remember, she still did. And maybe that was enough. When she finally returned to the apartment, Nolan was sitting at the table, staring down at his hands. He looked up as she entered, his eyes red and puffy from crying. "Meg, don't," she interrupted, walking over to him and sitting down. "Just don't apologize again." Nolan blinked, clearly unsure of what to say. Megan took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "I'm not leaving," she said quietly. "I'm staying." Nolan's eyes widened in surprise, his voice shaky. "Megan, you don't have to." "I know," she interrupted again, her voice steady. "I know I don't have to, but I'm choosing to. I don't know what the future looks like, Nolan, and I'm scared. I'm terrified of losing you, of watching you forget more and more of our life together. But I'm not walking away. Not now. Not like this." Nolan's face crumpled, tears spilling down his cheeks as he reached for her hand. "I don't deserve this," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Megan squeezed his hand tightly. "You don't get to decide that. I love you, Nolan. And even if you forget me, I'll still remember you. I'll remember us." They sat in silence for a long time, their hands intertwined, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. The future was uncertain, more uncertain than Megan had ever imagined, but she had made her choice. She would walk this path with him, no matter how difficult it became. Later that night, they walked through the park together, the world quiet around them. Nolan didn't speak much, but every now and then he would glance at her, as if trying to memorize her face, to hold onto this moment for as long as he could. Megan knew that one day, even this memory might fade for him, but for now, they had each other. And that was enough. Thank you so much for watching. If this emotional journey touched your heart and you're craving more stories full of surprises, make sure to subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss a new release. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and let us know in the comments what you thought of the story. We're excited to read your thoughts. See you in the next adventure.